2, Unit 2, Period 2, 16 rows 70, 1754. Part 2.1, Contextualizing Period 2. Setting the stage. What kind of world are we entering? All right, let's talk about one of the most consequential stretches of American history, the years between 1607 and 1754. Think of this period as the foundation being poured for a building that won't actually open its doors for another few decades. Everything that happens later, the Revolution, the Constitution, the whole American experiment, rests on what gets established right here. So when the AP exam asks you to contextualize period 2, it's asking you to zoom out and ask what forces were already in motion before Jamestown? And how did those forces shape everything that followed? Contextualization, by the way, is one of the most heavily tested historical thinking skills on the AP exam. It means you're not just describing what happened, you're explaining why the conditions existed for it to happen at all. Picture it, like explaining why a fire started. Sure, you can say a match was struck, but contextualization means you're also telling me there was dry timber, a strong wind, and someone who had a reason to light that match in the first place. The European background: competition, commerce, and religious upheaval. So what's the dry timber here? By the early 1600s, Europe is a pressure cooker. Spain has already been extracting enormous wealth from the Americas for over a century, and that wealth has reshuffled the entire European power structure. England, France, and the Netherlands are watching Spain get rich, and they want a piece of the action. This is the era of mercantilism, the economic theory that national power comes from accumulating wealth, especially precious metals, and that colonies exist to enrich the mother country. Keep that word mercantilism close. It explains practically every economic decision made in this period, and the AP exam loves to test whether you understand how it shaped colonial relationships. On top of the economic rivalry, Europe is being torn apart by religious conflict in the aftermath of the Protestant Reformation. The Reformation didn't just change where people went to church on Sunday. It fractured political allegiances, sparked wars, and sent hundreds of thousands of people searching for places where they could practice their faith without being persecuted. When you see Puritan settlers flooding into New England in the 1630s, you're watching that religious pressure release valve in action. 3 colonial regions, 3 very different worlds. One of the most important concepts in period 2 is that colonial America was never one thing. This is a classic AP pitfall. Students treat the colonies as a unified block, but the exam expects you to distinguish between 3 distinct regional patterns, each shaped by geography, economics, and the people who settled there. New England colonies were built around Puritan religious communities, small-scale farming, fishing, and trade. The land wasn't great for large-scale agriculture, so you don't see the plantation system developing there. Instead, you get tight-knit towns, town hall democracy, and a relatively diversified economy. The middle colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, were the most ethnically and religiously diverse, often called the breadbasket colonies because of their grain production. William Penn's Pennsylvania, in particular, stands out as an experiment in religious tolerance that was genuinely radical for its time. Then you have the Chesapeake and southern colonies, Virginia, Maryland. The Carolinas, where the story pivots sharply around tobacco, rice, indigo, and eventually enslaved labor. This is where you see the brutal logic of the plantation system taking hold. And it's absolutely central to understanding period 2. The transformation of labor, from indentured servitude to enslaved Africans. Speaking of labor, one of the most significant developments of this entire period is the transition from indentured servitude to race-based chattel slavery. In the early Chesapeake, planters relied heavily on white indentured servants, people who exchanged several years of labor for passage to the New World. But after Bacon's rebellion in 1676, when disgruntled former servants nearly burned Jamestown to the ground, colonial elites realized that a class of landless, angry white men was a dangerous thing. Enslaved Africans, they calculated, were a more controllable and permanent labor force. Over the following decades, legal codes hardened, the slave trade expanded dramatically, and what had been a relatively fluid racial hierarchy calcified into a rigid hereditary system of racial slavery. This is a turning point the AP exam returns to again and again. Indigenous peoples, not passive bystanders. Finally, Don't make the mistake of treating Native Americans as background scenery. In this period, indigenous peoples were active strategic agents who formed alliances, resisted encroachment, and shaped the contours of European settlement in profound ways. Conflicts like King Philip's War in New England and the Pueblo Revolt in the Southwest demonstrate that native resistance was fierce and consequential. European diseases, however, devastated indigenous populations in ways that no military strategy could fully overcome, fundamentally altering the demographic landscape of the continent, bringing it together. The key to contextualizing period 2 is recognizing that three massive forces, European imperial competition, the demand for labor, and the collision with indigenous peoples, were operating simultaneously and feeding off each other. Every specific event you study in this unit is really just one piece of that larger puzzle snapping into place. With this big picture firmly in mind, let's move into the specific settlements, policies, and conflicts that defined colonial life in the decades that followed. Part 2.2, European colonization. Setting the stage. All right, so picture this. It's the early 1600s, and Europe is basically a continent full of ambitious, cash-strapped monarchies, all eyeing the same prize, the New World. England, France, Spain, and the Netherlands each had their own reasons for showing up on North American shores. And how they showed up tells you almost everything about the colonies they built. That's the heart of this section. And the AP exam loves to test whether you understand not just what happened, but why different European powers colonized so differently. The Spanish model, conquest and extraction. Let's start with Spain, since they got there first in a meaningful way. The Spanish model was essentially built on extraction, get in, find the gold and silver, and use indigenous and enslaved labor to ship that wealth back to the crown. Think of it like a company that sets up a branch office not to serve the local community, but purely to drain the register and send the profits to headquarters. The encomienda system formalized this. Spanish colonizers were granted rights to indigenous labor in exchange for supposedly civilizing and Christianizing them. In practice, it was brutal forced labor that decimated native populations across the Caribbean and Central and South America. By the time Spanish influence crept into the North American Southwest and Florida, the template was already well established. Key AP pitfall here is conflating Spanish colonization with English colonization. They had fundamentally different goals, labor systems, and relationships with indigenous peoples. The French and Dutch approaches, trade and relationships. The French took a markedly different approach, and this is one of the more nuanced contrasts you need to own going into the exam. French colonizers in Canada and the Great Lakes region weren't primarily there to build sprawling agricultural settlements. They were after the fur trade, which meant they actually needed indigenous peoples as partners, not as subjects to be subdued. This created a much more cooperative, though never perfectly equal, set of relationships with native nations. The French intermarried more frequently with indigenous peoples and built diplomatic alliances that would shape the balance of power in North America for over a century. Think of it less like a landlord-tenant relationship and more like a business partnership. However uneven, the Dutch in New Netherland, modern-day New York, were similarly trade-focused, establishing fur trading posts rather than massive agricultural colonies. Their presence was ultimately short-lived. The English seized New Netherland in 1664. But their legacy shaped the cultural diversity of the Mid-Atlantic region in ways that still echo today. The English model, settlement and permanence. England's approach was the most varied and the most consequential for what would eventually become the United States. Unlike Spain's extraction economy or France's trading partnerships, English colonization was defined by permanent settlement. English colonists came to stay. They brought families, built towns, cleared land, and established legislatures. This is huge, and the AP exam will absolutely Here's a mnemonic worth holding on to. Think FASEPA, Spain. Extracted. France partnered, England planted. It's a little goofy, but it'll save you on a multiple choice question at 8 a.m. when your brain hasn't fully booted up yet. Now, within English colonization, you need to remember that not all colonies were the same. The Virginia Company backed Jamestown in 1607 as a profit-seeking venture, essentially a corporate colony. New England colonies like Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay were founded largely for religious reasons by Puritans seeking to build what John Winthrop famously called a city upon a hill. The middle colonies like Pennsylvania and New York were more ethnically and religiously diverse, focused on commerce. And the southern colonies developed plantation agriculture that would increasingly rely on enslaved African labor. These regional differences within English colonization are a favorite AP comparison prompt, so get comfortable moving between them. Indigenous responses and displacement. No discussion of European colonization is complete without centering indigenous responses because the AP exam has increasingly emphasized this perspective. Native peoples were not passive victims. They resisted, negotiated, allied strategically, and adapted. The Powhatan Confederacy in Virginia, for example, initially saw the English as potential trading partners and tried to incorporate them into existing diplomatic frameworks. When that failed, conflict erupted. Across North America, native nations played European powers against each other, sometimes with remarkable success. Understanding that indigenous peoples had agency, the power to make choices and shape outcomes, is essential for earning points on free response questions. Key relationships and AP pitfalls. One more relationship to cement. European colonization patterns were driven by a combination of home country goals: mercantilism, religious competition, geopolitical rivalry, the specific geography and resources of where colonizers landed, and the nature of interactions with indigenous peoples. When you see an AP prompt asking you to explain why a colony developed the way it did, you want to triangulate those three factors every single time. Don't just say England wanted to make money. Get specific about which colony, which labor system, and which indigenous context shaped the outcome. A common mistake students make is treating European colonization as a single unified process. It wasn't. It was messy, competitive, ideologically diverse, and deeply shaped by the people who were already living here. With colonization patterns firmly in your mental toolkit, we're now ready to explore how those early settlements developed their own distinct social, economic, and political identities, which brings us right into the world of the colonial societies that emerged across British North America. Part 2.3, The Regions of British Colonies. Setting the scene. Imagine you're looking at a map of Britain's North American colonies in the early 1700s. At first glance, it might look like one big unified project, Britain's grand experiment in the New World. But here's the thing. These colonies were about as unified as a group of strangers who just happened to live on the same street. They shared a landlord, sure, but their day-to-day lives, economies, social structures, and values were radically different depending on where you landed. That regional diversity is exactly what AP exam writers love to test. So let's break it down in a way that actually sticks. New England, the Puritan work, ethic in action. Start up north with New England, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire. The geography here is your first clue to everything else. The soil is rocky and the growing season is short, which means large-scale plantation agriculture was never really in the cards. So what did New Englanders do? They turned to the sea and to each other, fishing, shipbuilding, and trade became the economic backbone of the region. Towns were tightly clustered, and the Puritan religious culture reinforced a strong sense of community obligation. The famous town meeting became the seabed of participatory democracy, decisions made locally by consensus, with everyone expected to show up and have a say. Here's your key relationship to memorize. In New England, religion shaped everything: economy, politics, family structure, education. The founding of Harvard in 1636, just 6 years after Massachusetts Bay was established, tells you all you need to know about how seriously these people took literacy and religious education. A common AP pitfall is assuming New England was economically backward compared to the South. It wasn't. It just operated on a different model, one built on commerce and skilled labor rather than staple crop agriculture. The Middle Colonies, America's first melting pot. Slide down the map to New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware, the middle colonies, and suddenly the picture gets much more complicated and, frankly, much more interesting. Think of this region as the colonial version of a busy international airport. You've got Dutch settlers, German immigrants, Quakers, Catholics, Jews, Scots-Irish farmers, and enslaved Africans all occupying the same general space. This ethnic and religious diversity made the middle colonies the most pluralistic region in British North America. The geography here was a gift. Rich, fertile soil in the river valleys and a moderate climate meant farmers could grow wheat and other grains in serious quantities. These became known as the breadbasket colonies, a term worth memorizing because it shows up on AP exams with some regularity. Cities like Philadelphia and New York grew into bustling commercial hubs. The key concept to hold on to is that the middle colonies represent a kind of early prototype for American pluralism. Different groups coexisting, sometimes uneasily, but coexisting nonetheless. The Chesapeake and southern colonies, tobacco, rice, and brutal labor, now move south to the Chesapeake region, Virginia, and Maryland, and then further down to the Carolinas and Georgia, and the entire vibe shifts here. The warm climate and fertile lowlands made large-scale agriculture not just possible, but enormously profitable. Tobacco in the Chesapeake, rice and indigo in the Carolinas, these were cash crops that could make a planter fabulously wealthy. And that wealth came at an unconscionable human cost. The labor demand created by these plantation economies drove the expansion of chattel slavery in ways that would define American history for centuries. By the early 1700s, the Chesapeake had shifted from relying heavily on white indentured servants who were increasingly troublesome and demanding, as Bacon's rebellion in 1676 illustrated, toward an entrenched system of African enslaved labor. This is a crucial cause and effect relationship the AP exam tests repeatedly. The failure and decline of indentured servitude directly accelerated the growth of race-based slavery in the South. The social structure here was sharply hierarchical. A small planter elite dominated political and economic life, while poor white farmers, indentured servants, and enslaved people occupied the lower rungs. Unlike New England's town meetings, Southern political culture was oligarchic, power concentrated in the hands of the few. The common AP pitfall and a helpful mnemonic. Students often blur these regions together on free response questions. So here's a mnemonic to keep them straight. Think in New England works, middle mingles, South grows. New England builds its identity around community, trade, and religious purpose. The middle colonies mix diverse peoples and grow grain. The South grows cash crops on the backs of enslaved labor and builds a rigid social hierarchy. One more pitfall worth flagging. Don't assume that because these regions were all British, they were naturally aligned. Their different economies created genuinely different interests that would eventually fuel the tensions of the Revolutionary era. The seeds of American regional conflict, North versus South, commercial versus agrarian, were planted right here in period 2. Wrapping up, the regional differences you've just learned aren't just historical trivia. They're the foundation for understanding almost every major conflict and debate in American history that follows from the Constitutional Convention all the way to the Civil War, which makes our next section on colonial society and its tensions a natural and essential next step. Part 2.4, Transatlantic Trade. Setting the scene, all right? Picture this. It's the early 1600s, and Europe is basically a teenager who just discovered the mall. There's all this incredible stuff out there. Sugar, tobacco, silver, furs. And suddenly there's a whole new hemisphere to shop from. That hunger, that relentless appetite for goods and profit, is the engine behind everything we're talking about in this section. Transatlantic trade didn't just move products across an ocean. It rewired the entire world economy and set the stage for centuries of history that followed. Mercantilism, the big idea. Before we get into the ships and the goods, you need to lock down one concept that explains why European powers were so obsessed with their colonies. In mercantilism, think of mercantilism as the economic philosophy that wealth is a pie, and there's only so much pie to go around. If England got a bigger slice, France got a smaller one. The goal then was to accumulate as much gold and silver as possible while exporting more than you imported, a favorable balance of trade. Colonies existed Under this logic, to serve the mother country, they were supposed to supply raw materials cheaply and then buy finished goods back from England. The colonists were essentially the farm and the customer rolled into one, and they didn't get much say in the arrangement. England enforced this system through a series of navigation acts, starting in 1651, which required colonial goods to be shipped on English vessels and pass through English ports. This is a huge AP concept, so burn it into your memory. Navigation acts equals mercantilist control over colonial trade. The triangular trade. Now here's where it gets both fascinating and deeply troubling. The mechanism that made this whole system hum was the S02A network of exchange routes connecting Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Picture a triangle drawn across the Atlantic Ocean. European manufactured goods, guns, cloth, rum, traveled to West Africa. From Africa, enslaved people were transported across the Atlantic in the horrific Middle Passage to the Americas. Then colonial raw materials, tobacco, sugar, rice, indigo, sailed back to Europe to complete the loop. The Middle Passage is something you must understand, not just as an AP term, but as a human reality. Enslaved Africans were packed into ships under brutal, inhumane conditions. Mortality rates on these voyages were staggering. This forced migration fundamentally shaped the demographic, cultural, and economic landscape of the Americas, particularly in the southern colonies in the Caribbean, where plantation agriculture depended entirely on enslaved labor. Regional economic differences. One thing the AP exam loves to test is how transatlantic trade played out differently across colonial regions, so don't treat the colonies as one monolithic blob. In the U southern colonies, Virginia, Maryland, the Carolinas, Georgia, the economy was built on cash crops, tobacco in the Chesapeake, rice and indigo in the Carolinas. These crops required intensive labor, which is why slavery took such deep root here. The plantation system wasn't just a farming method. It was an entire social and economic order. The New England colonies, by contrast, had rocky soil that wasn't great for large-scale agriculture. So they pivoted toward trade, shipbuilding, fishing, and manufacturing. New England merchants became key middlemen in the Atlantic economy. The Columbian Exchange hangover. You'll remember the Columbian Exchange from Period 1, but its effects are still echoing loudly here in Period 2. The massive influx of silver from Spanish colonies in the Americas caused price inflation across Europe, too much money chasing the same amount of goods. Meanwhile, American crops like tobacco and sugar were creating entirely new consumer habits and markets. These weren't neutral economic forces. They created winners and losers, shaped which colonies became valuable, and determined who got exploited to make it all work. Common AP pitfalls. Here's where students trip up every single time. First, don't confuse the intent of the navigation acts benefiting England with their effect on colonists, building resentment that eventually fuels revolutionary sentiment. Second, be precise about the triangular trade. The AP exam will check whether you know what moved in which direction. Goods to Africa, enslaved people to the Americas, raw materials to Europe. Third, don't flatten colonial economies into one story. Regional differences matter enormously on the exam and in essays. A handy mnemonic for the triangular trade legs. Gore, Esri. Goods to Africa, Esri Africans to Americas, with raw materials to Europe. Why it all matters. Transatlantic trade wasn't just economics, it was the architecture of the colonial world. It determined who had power, who was enslaved, which regions grew wealthy, and which populations were devastated. It embedded an inequality into the American economy that would prove extraordinarily difficult to uproot. When you see an AP essay prompt asking about economic development, labor systems, or colonial society, transatlantic trade is almost always the foundation underneath it. With this economic framework in place, We're ready to zoom in on the people living inside this system, the settlers, the enslaved, and the indigenous, and examine how colonial societies actually took shape on the ground, which is exactly where we're headed next. Part 2.5 Interactions between American Indians and Europeans. Setting the stage. All right, let's talk about one of the most complex, misunderstood, and absolutely critical topics on the AP exam: the relationships between American Indians and European colonizers in the colonial period. And I want you to resist the urge to think of this as a simple story of Europeans arrived, Native Americans suffered. That framing will cost you points. The real story is layered, strategic, and full of agency on all sides. Trade, alliance, and mutual dependence. When Europeans first arrived in significant numbers, many American Indian nations saw them the same way they saw other powerful neighbors, as potential allies, trading partners, or threats to be managed. The fur trade is your best example here. French traders in the Great Lakes region built remarkably cooperative relationships with nations like the Huron and Algonquin. Think of it like a business partnership. The French needed furs to satisfy an insatiable European market for beaver felt hats, and the native nations needed European metal tools, firearms, and cloth that genuinely improved daily life. Neither side was helpless. Neither side was just reacting. The English in the Chesapeake had a similar dynamic early on. The Powhatan Confederacy under Chief Powhatan initially traded food with the starving Jamestown settlers. And that wasn't charity, it was calculated diplomacy. Powhatan likely saw the English as a potential source of metal goods and maybe even a military ally against rival nations. The famous story of Pocahontas, by the way, almost certainly reflects a staged adoption ceremony meant to incorporate John Smith, and by extension the English, into the Powhatan political world. The English didn't understand what was happening. They thought they were almost executed. Classic cross-cultural miscommunication. The Columbian Exchange and its devastating asymmetry. Now here's where things get tragically imbalanced. The Columbian Exchange, the transfer of plants, animals, and diseases between hemispheres, sounds neutral, but it wasn't. American Indians had no prior exposure to Old World diseases like smallpox, measles, and typhus, meaning they had no developed immunity. Some historians estimate that between 50 and 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas died within a century of contact. Let that number sink in for a second. It's one of the largest demographic catastrophes in human history. This matters enormously for the AP exam because it reshapes everything that follows. When English settlers arrived in New England in the 1620s, they found cleared land and abandoned villages, the result of epidemic disease that had swept through just years earlier. The Pilgrims interpreted this as divine providence clearing the land for them. In reality, they were settling the ruins of population collapse. Conflict, competition, and the shifting balance of power. As European settlements expanded, cooperation gave way to increasing conflict. But again, don't oversimplify. American Indian nations weren't passive victims. They adapted, formed new alliances, and pushed back hard. King Philip's War, 1675 to 1676, 67. New England is your go-to example here. Metacom, called King Philip by the English, led a multi-tribal coalition against English expansion in one of the most devastating conflicts in colonial history proportionally. The English ultimately won, but they suffered enormous losses. This was not a foregone conclusion. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680 is another must-know event. The Pueblo peoples of the Southwest, under the leadership of Pope, successfully drove Spanish colonizers entirely out of present-day New Mexico for 12 years. 12 years. That's not a footnote. That's a testament to organized, effective resistance. A common AP pitfall here is treating all European-Indian relations as identical. They weren't. The Spanish used the encomiende system, essentially enslaving native labor to work mines and plantations, which created deep structural exploitation. The French, with smaller settler populations and a trade-based economy, tended to have more cooperative relationships and were far more likely to intermarry with native populations. The English fell somewhere in between, though their hunger for agricultural land made the long-term coexistence nearly impossible. You can share a beaver pond, but you can't share a cornfield. Mnemonic and exam tip for remembering the major dynamics. Try FTADEED. Radiate created early cooperation. Gay alliances shifted based on competing interests. Also, watch out for this. The AP exam loves to test whether you understand that American Indians exercised agency, meaning they made strategic choices rather than simply reacting to Europeans. Words like accommodation, resistance, and negotiation should be in your vocabulary when you write about this period. Why this all matters. The interactions in this period set the template for everything that comes after. The displacement, the treaty systems, the racial hierarchies that get baked into colonial law. Understanding the roots here makes period 3 and beyond makes so much more sense. As we move into the next section, we'll see how these tensions between European powers and between colonizers and colonized peoples start reshaping the political landscape of North America in ways nobody in 1650 could have fully predicted. Part 2.6, Slavery in the British Colonies. The foundation. Why slavery took hold. Let's talk about something that sits at the very heart of American history, and something the AP exam will absolutely test you on. Slavery in the British colonies didn't appear overnight like a thunderstorm. It developed gradually, almost incrementally, shaped by economic desperation, racial ideology, and legal architecture that colonists built brick by brick over decades. Start with the labor problem. Early colonial planters, especially in the Chesapeake region of Virginia and Maryland, needed massive amounts of labor to grow tobacco, their cash crop lifeline. At first, they turned to indentured servants, poor English men and women who traded 4 to 7 years of labor for passage to the New World. This seemed like a reasonable solution, until it wasn't. Bacon's rebellion in 1676 is your warning signal here. When armed, landless, disgruntled former indentured servants nearly burned Jamestown to the ground, the planter class got a very uncomfortable message. Free white laborers with guns and grievances are a political time bomb. Enslaved Africans, stripped of legal rights and social networks, seemed, from the planters' cold, calculating perspective, like a more controllable workforce. That shift in thinking changed everything. Building a legal system of oppression, here's where you need to slow down and really absorb this. Because the ape loves asking about the mechanisms of slavery, not just that it existed, but how it was institutionalized. Virginia's slave codes of the late 1600s are the key example. Before these laws, the status of Africans in the colonies was actually murky. Some black individuals who arrived in the early 1600s were treated similarly to indentured servants and eventually gained freedom. But as tobacco profits soared and demand for labor exploded, colonial legislatures began systematically closing those doors. The slave codes defined enslaved people as property, not people, but chattel. They made slavery inheritable through the mother, meaning that if a woman was enslaved, her child was enslaved regardless of the father's status. Think about what that legal sleight of hand accomplished. It permanently expanded the enslaved population without importing a single additional person. It also horrifyingly gave slaveholders a financial incentive in the most intimate human relationships imaginable. These codes stripped enslaved people of the right to own property, testify in court, learn to read, or move freely. A whole scaffolding of law was constructed to make exploitation permanent and inescapable. Regional variations, not one story, but many. The AP exam expects you to know that slavery looked different depending on where you were. In the Chesapeake, tobacco was king, and enslaved people worked in small to mid-sized groups alongside their enslavers on scattered farms. There was relatively more daily contact between enslaved people and white colonists here compared to other regions. Move south to Bill's South Carolina and Georgia, and you enter a completely different world. Rice and indigo cultivation required specific agricultural knowledge that enslaved Africans from the rice-growing regions of West Africa actually brought with them. This is a critical point. Planters in the Low Country specifically sought enslaved people from certain African regions precisely because of their expertise. These colonies developed The numbers were smaller, but the institution was present and legally protected throughout the colonies. African cultural resilience and the Gullah Geechee example. Enslaved Africans were not passive recipients of this system. They actively preserved and adapted their cultures under extraordinarily brutal conditions. One of the most vivid examples is the Gullah Geechee culture that developed along the South Carolina and Georgia coasts because the Low Country's plantation geography was so isolated, and because planters were often absent during disease season. Enslaved communities there maintained significant African linguistic, spiritual, and cultural practices. The Gullah language itself is a Creole blend of English and West African languages, and it survived into the modern era. This is your reminder that cultural endurance is itself a form of resistance. Common AP pitfalls and the big picture. A few things to lock in before you move on. First, don't confuse the timeline. Slavery became legally codified through slave codes in the late 1600s, after decades of ambiguity. Second, remember that the shift from indentured servitude to enslaved African labor was driven by economic and political calculation, not just pre-existing racial prejudice, though racial ideology developed alongside and reinforced the economic system in a feedback loop. Third, the AP frequently asks about how slavery shaped colonial society broadly. It created a wealthy planter class, widened inequality among white colonists, and generated deep political and social tensions that echoed forward across centuries. A handy mnemonic to remember the key forces at play: cash crops needed labor. Economic fears after Bacon's Rebellion. Legal slave codes institutionalized the system, drawn from specific African regions with expertise. Those four threads weave together to explain how British colonial slavery became what it became. With slavery's foundations now firmly in place, we're ready to move into the broader social and cultural dynamics of colonial British America, a world increasingly shaped by the brutal engine we've just examined. Part 2.7, Colonial Society and Culture. Society in the making. All right, picture this. You've just crossed a 3,000-mile ocean. You've left behind everything familiar, and now you're standing in a strange land, trying to figure out how a society is supposed to work from scratch. That's the situation colonists were navigating throughout the 1600s and early 1700s, and the culture they built was a fascinating, sometimes contradictory mix of Old World inheritance and New World improvisation. For the AP exam, this is the section where the texture of colonial life really comes into focus. And trust me, the College Board loves to test whether you understand the nuances here, not just the surface level fact. Social hierarchy and the class structure. One of the most important things to understand is that colonial society was not a land of equality, not even close. The colonists brought European ideas about hierarchy right across the Atlantic with them. At the top, you had wealthy planters, merchants, and large landowners. Below them sat a middling class of small farmers, artisans, and tradespeople. Then came indentured servants, and at the very bottom, enslaved Africans who had no legal personhood whatsoever. Here's a key AP pitfall to avoid. Students often assume that because colonial America eventually became a democracy, it must have felt democratic during this period. It didn't. Social deference? The expectation that you'd respect and defer to your betters was baked into everyday life. A farmer knew his place relative to a local magistrate, just as much as a lord and a peasant knew their places in England. The role of religion. Religion wasn't just Sunday morning in colonial America. It was the operating system of social life. In New England, the Puritan tradition shaped everything from government to education. The Puritans believed in a covenant theology, the idea that God had made a collective agreement with their community when things went wrong, a drought, a disease outbreak. It was read as a sign of community sin. This created a powerful social pressure toward conformity. Meanwhile, down in the middle colonies, you had a remarkable religious pluralism: Quakers in Pennsylvania, Dutch Reformed congregations in New York, Catholics in Maryland. The religious map looked more like a patchwork quilt than a single color. This pluralism is part of why the middle colonies developed a more tolerant, commercially minded culture. The Great Awakening, which sweeps through the colonies in the 1730s and 1740s, is the other massive religious story here. Preachers like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield electrified colonial audiences by preaching an emotional, personal faith that challenged the established church hierarchy. Think of it as the first truly shared colonial experience, a spiritual viral moment before the internet existed. It also subtly Education and the press. Education in colonial America was deeply uneven, but some patterns matter for the exam. New England led the way, largely because Puritans believed you needed to read the Bible yourself. The Massachusetts Bay Colony passed the Old Deluder Satan Act of 1647, requiring towns of a certain size to establish schools. A remarkable early commitment to public education. Harvard College, founded in 1636, was training ministers from very early on. The growth of the colonial press is another big idea. By the early 1700s, newspapers were circulating in Boston, Philadelphia, and New York. The 1735 trial of printer John Peter Zenger is a landmark moment. He was acquitted of libel charges for criticizing the colonial governor of New York, and it helped establish the principle that truth could be a defense against the libel. It's an early imperfect step toward freedom of the press. Family life and gender roles. Family was the basic unit of colonial economic and social life. Men were the legal heads of household, owning property and participating in civic life. Women's legal status was covered by the doctrine of coverture, meaning a married woman's legal identity was essentially absorbed into her husband's. She couldn't own property, sign contracts, or sue in court on her own. That said, women were essential to household economies, managing food production, childcare, textile work, and sometimes running family businesses when husbands were away or had died. One nuance worth holding on to: Puritan women in New England had slightly more agency in religious life than their counterparts elsewhere, since the church community was so central to everything. But don't over-romanticize it. Patriarchy was firmly in place across all the colonies. Regional differences. A master move on the AP exam is connecting cultural patterns to regional geography and economics. New England's culture was shaped by its town meeting governance, Congregationalist churches, and a mixed economy of farming, fishing, and trade. The Chesapeake and southern colonies developed a planter-dominated hierarchy built on tobacco and increasingly enslaved labor, a culture of honor, hierarchy, and aristocratic aspiration. The middle colonies, with their ethnic and religious diversity and bustling port cities like Philadelphia, were the most cosmopolitan of the bunch. The key relationship to remember is this: economy shapes culture. Where you grew what and who did the labor determined almost everything about how society was organized. Quick mnemonic to remember the three regional cultural flavors. Think Middle England equals church, middle equal commerce, south equals cotton and glass. As to simplification, but it'll anchor the distinctions in your memory when you're staring at an essay prompt under pressure. With a rich understanding of colonial society's textures and tensions, you're perfectly positioned to explore how these deeply rooted cultural divisions shape the conflicts and compromises. It defined the colonial relationship with Britain, which is exactly where we're headed next. Part 2.8, Comparison in Period 2. Setting the stage. Why? Comparison matters. All right, so here we are at section 2.8, the comparison section for period 2. Think of this as your bird's eye view moment where we zoom way out and ask, how did different colonial regions actually differ from each other, and why does that matter? The AP exam loves this kind of synthesis thinking. It's not enough to know what happened in Virginia or Massachusetts in isolation. You need to be able to hold multiple regions up side by side and explain why they developed so differently, even though they were all technically English colonies during roughly the same era, 6007 to 1754. Here's a useful analogy. Imagine 3 siblings raised by the same parents, but sent to live in completely different environments. One in a desert, one in a rainforest, one in a mountain town. They share the same DNA, but their daily lives, habits, and priorities end up looking wildly different. That's essentially what happened with the Chesapeake, New England, and the middle colonies. The Chesapeake versus New England, a tale of 2 motivations. Start with motivation, because that's the engine driving everything else. The Chesapeake colonies, Virginia and Maryland, were founded primarily for economic profit. The Virginia Company wanted a return on investment, plain and simple. This produced a society laser-focused on cash crops, first tobacco and later others, which then created a brutal demand for labor. That demand pulled first indentured servants across the Atlantic, and then, as the century progressed, enslaved Africans in They were fleeing religious persecution, and they came with a communal mission to build what John Winthrop famously called a city upon a hill. This shaped everything. New England towns clustered tightly around a meeting house. Families came over together rather than as lone young men seeking fortune. Literacy rates were remarkably high because reading the Bible mattered deeply, and the economy, while not glamorous fishing, timber, small-scale farming, was diverse and relatively stable. No single cash crop meant no desperate scramble for cheap mass labor in the same way. A classic AP pitfall here. Students sometimes assume that because New England was more religious, it was more egalitarian or tolerant. Not so fast. The Puritan leadership could be deeply authoritarian. Just ask Roger Williams or Anne Hutchinson, both of whom were banished for challenging the Puritan establishment. Theocracy and democracy are not synonyms. The middle colonies, the forgotten middle child. Now, the middle colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, often get overlooked, but the AP exam rewards students who can speak to their distinctiveness. If the Chesapeake was built on hierarchy and New England on religious conformity, the middle colonies were defined by diversity and tolerance, at least in relative terms, Pennsylvania especially. Founded by William Penn as a Quaker haven, attracted a remarkable mix of English, Dutch, Germans, Scots-Irish, and others. Religious pluralism wasn't just tolerated, it was kind of the point. Economically, the middle colonies hit a sweet spot. Fertile soil and a temperate climate made them the breadbasket of the colonies, producing wheat and grains that fed both the colonists and the Atlantic trade network. This created a thriving merchant class and bustling port cities like Philadelphia and New York, precursors to the commercial powerhouses. They'd become centuries later. Labor, race, and the diverging paths. One of the most critical comparisons the AP exam will ask you to make involves labor systems and the development of racial slavery. This is where regional differences become morally urgent, not just academically interesting. The Chesapeake's plantation economy created the demand structure that hardened chattel slavery into law through a series of Virginia statutes in the mid to late 1600s. Race-based slavery as a legal institution was essentially invented in the Chesapeake as a solution to the labor problem. New England had enslaved people too. Don't let the narrative of a purely free North fool you, but the scale and the structural centrality were different. In the Chesapeake and later the Carolina Low Country, slavery was the economic foundation. In New England, it was peripheral. mnemonic to lock it in. Here's a quick memory anchor. M-A-C-E-E-O-U-N-E. Chesapeake for cash, New England for God, middle for mix. It's simple, but it captures the essential motivational difference driving each region's development. Common AP exam traps. Watch out for 2 traps. First, don't homogenize the South. Virginia and South Carolina had meaningfully different labor and demographic patterns even within the colonial South. Second, don't treat these regions as hermetically sealed. They traded with each other, influenced each other, and by 1754 were increasingly aware of themselves as interconnected parts of something larger. With those comparisons firmly in hand, you're ready to start thinking about how these regional identities would create friction and eventually forge a complicated, contested national identity, which is exactly